Welcome back to Real America. He's the founder of Turning Point USA, a best-selling author, along with being the host of the Charlie Kirk Show and also the chairman of Students for Trump. Welcome to Real America, Charlie Kirk. Charlie, how you doing, sir?
Doing great. Thank you for having me.
Hey, thank you so much for joining us. By the way, happy birthday. It's coming up here in a couple days, right?
That's right. Yeah, the 14th.
You're going to be a big whopping 27. And look at all that you've done for the conservative folks, the teenagers, the college kids out there across this country to keep that voice going for conservative values. So I want to thank you, sir, right off the bat, not only for coming on the show, but for keeping that message going. You got started with this at a young age. If people don't know who Charlie Kirk is, give them some background. I know you grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. You got involved in the conservative movement at a very young age, but fill us in.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in the Chicago suburbs, went to Wheeling High School, wanted to go to West Point, didn't get in. My rejection ended up being the best thing that never happened to me. Started Turning Point USA, and here we are 8.5 years later. 2,000 high school and college campuses represented, well over 150 people on staff and growing. We also do 2 hours of radio a day on the Charlie Kirk Show, unrelated, outside of Turning Point USA, I should say. Charlie Kirk Show podcast, wrote a couple books. So only in America could a story like this, where a kid doesn't go to college and believe in the country, actually accomplish a little bit of something. So very blessed, and wish I could take credit for it. We have a great team here.
Charlie, I feel you, man. I grew up in a small farming community in Northwest Ohio, about 4,000 people. I did go in the military, enlisted Air Force as a combat journalist, working for the Armed Forces Radio Television Service. Did not get my degree with my GI Bill, went right into television, and here we are today, helping to spread the conservative values and give a voice to conservatives in America. So I'm right there with you, brother. Let's talk about your mission, because, man, the last few years you've been on fire hitting these college campuses and high school campuses, and I appreciate that because I have a daughter turning 13 in a couple days, and I am so worried about the curriculum that's being taught in schools, at the middle school level even. Obviously, we know at high school and college, the stuff that's been being spewed out there to these kids. Talk to the folks out there about your mission to go around and let kids know that what some of these liberal professors and teachers are spewing to them about American history, about American values, and about democracy is just plain BS.
Yeah, we need to make our kids love America again, and we need to be unafraid about talking about it. And if you're not able to clearly communicate what your country stands for and the values that built your country, the country will cease to exist. And so 43% of young people believe that America's a good country. Only 43%, wow. 57% believe that we're an awful country. That's not my polling, that's Gallup. And that's down nearly 30% from 10 years ago. What happened in 10 years? We doubled our college population in 10 years. We sent twice as many kids to college in the last decade than the decade prior. Some of it was with good intention, some of it was not, but the result is inarguable. A generation that is endlessly in debt. They own next to nothing. They have no skills. They have very little motivation and self-confidence destroyed. They're hyper-addicted to their cell phones and almost are pseudo-cyborgs in some ways. And they've also been filled with really bad ideas. So you put all that together, you say that is a perfect baseline for a pseudo-Marxist revolution in the country. And so there's a lot of work to do. The President of the United States, I believe, is all that stands between this country and a deluge of Marxism that, quite honestly, will be so radical it'll make Maduro look like a moderate.
And I would add to that the Democrat Party, along with the help from the mainstream left-wing biased media, has turned these young people into victims. We had a professor on the show a couple of weeks ago, an African-American professor in his 70s, who obviously saw the civil rights movement, sees what's going on today with Antifa and BLM, and point blank said this is what Democrats and the media have done to the black community. They've turned them into victims, and then they act like they're their saviors. And I feel they do it to millennials and college and high school kids today, where they're like, you need, instead of the American way, you need to get out there, bust your you-know-what, and get it yourself. And by the way, we'll take care of you. We'll help you. You need us. You need government. And they're turning them into sheep, like you said, like almost like cyborgs, like robots with, spewing the information to them. I want to get your take on a whole bunch of stuff that's going on, because obviously we're about, 26 days till the election. You saw the last two debates. We'll go with the most recent one. And then let's get into what the media is doing once again to President Trump. The VP debate, I don't care what side of the aisle you're on. If you watch that 92 minutes, Vice President Pence won that debate. Miss Harris looked like she is a typical flip-flopper on every single issue. And then the media calls our president a racist and sexist for calling her a communist and a monster. Your thoughts?
Well, I think Pence won decisively. I think Pence really helped a lot in bringing Republican satisfaction not satisfaction, but kind of a little bit more stability that even those center-right voters, they might have complaints about Trump's style or tone. I don't share those complaints, but some people say that. That's a common kind of piece of criticism, that they can agree with the Trump administration on policy. And that is something that is really important. And Vice President Pence was calm, cool, and collected. He was stoic in all means, in every way possible. And Senator Harris refused to talk about how she wants the Green New Deal, that she wants to ban fracking in our country and also pack the courts, flood the courts with radicals. And I think Mike Pence did a phenomenal job of putting her really on notice on those issues.
Let's talk a little bit about what a Biden presidency over the next 4 years versus a Trump presidency would look like, in your opinion. You just talked a lot about Marxism and communism. I don't know that Joe Biden is definitely that guy, but he's being used, as far as I'm concerned, as a puppet for that movement. Would you agree with that and expand on what the huge polarization and differences would be between him winning versus Trump for the next 4 years in this country?
Yeah, I think Biden is much more of a corporate Democrat. I think that he definitely would protect the big tech companies. I think he'd protect the big telecom companies. I think he'd protect the big pharmaceutical companies. And so I think that in some ways we're getting closer to fascism, not because of Donald Trump, but because of the Democrat Party, than socialism. But that can turn on a dime. I mean, that philosophical bridge from fascism to socialism is not, we're told it's right versus left or the opposite. They're actually just different approaches of government centralized control. So Joe Biden does want a bigger government, no doubt. Joe Biden just wants that bigger government to serve the one's interests of the few and the well-connected, such as the biggest corporations in our country. And so what the scary thing, though, is as soon as he expands government to be bigger than private industry, and as soon as he picks the small select few of small businesses to benefit the governmental ruling class, then all of a sudden you're ripe for a Marxist revolution right after that. And he will be puppeteered. He is being puppeteered by bitter Trotskyites that would have made phenomenal baseline revolutionaries in the Bolshevik Revolution. And even beyond that, what does a Biden presidency look like? The embassy in Jerusalem will be shut down, the Golan Heights being given back to Syria, the borders wide open, our manufacturing jobs will no longer be coming back from overseas. The Chinese Communist Party will own this century, and it will be the disintegration of America.
I agree with you. You know, when they talk about our biggest threat, and the Democrats just want to keep throwing out Russia is our biggest threat, and how the president butters up to Putin because they want to keep spreading that lie of the Russian hoax from 4 years ago, which we now have seen evidence that it all came from the Hillary camp, and they totally ignore the fact that China is the biggest threat. We've just seen it with the spread of COVID, with our intellectual property being stolen, with the trade deals that we've suffered under with China for decades. And then you hear Nancy Pelosi say on camera to, I think it was MSNBC or CNN about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, that, well, the research shows and what we're hearing, the chatter from the intelligence is China would prefer a Biden presidency. No kidding, Nancy. And that's exactly what you just said, that is, I think, our biggest threat. Let's talk about your two organizations, Turning Point USA and Students for Trump. Your mission out there, obviously, to get young folks involved in the conservative movement and vote. What do you think President Trump in this last 3.5 weeks versus the Biden camp needs to do to push and really make sure he shores up and locks in that millennial vote?
It's a great question. There's a new couple surveys that are out, and they're not even polls. These are much deeper than polls. These are many different demographics and over time of where does Gen Z feel about voting? Generation Z is not enthusiastic about Biden. What's amazing is that if you take a Gen Z Trump supporter and you take a Gen Z Biden supporter, a Gen Z Trump supporter is 10 times more enthusiastic to go vote than a Gen Z Biden supporter. So the enthusiasm gap is multi-generational. Secondly, there will be less Gen Z and millennials that vote in this election than probably in the last 20 years of young people. They are unenthused. They are not engaged. Voter registration numbers are down. Campus voting registration has now been closed in many states, and it is 94% decrease in some of these key battleground states, which are typically places for many left-wing voter turnout drives happen on campus. I think that Donald Trump is going to win if the youth vote heads in the current direction right now. Young voters are not turning out. Young voters are not enthusiastic, and the ones that are are for President Trump. I did this on my radio show today. I said, if this document is true, if the polling is true that I'm looking at, Donald Trump will win 4 more years. It's that simple.
I'm going to end the interview right there. Can't get any better than that. Charlie Kirk, Turning Point USA, author, man, you're doing it all. Students for Trump. There's so many titles, you don't have time to list them. Charlie, do me a solid. Come back on the show. I love what you have to say, and I love what you're doing.
You got it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Coming up after the break, he's a former CIA analyst and deputy assistant to President Trump, and he has a lot to say about the investigation into the Hillary Clinton campaign organizing the whole Russian hoax against the Trump campaign back in 2016. You don't want to miss this interview. We're back in 2.